The king ordered her dragged into the courtyard at dawn. In front of the entire castle he called her a thief. She had only been gathering herbs to save her dying child. But the king refused to listen. That same night, it was the prince himself who stopped breathing. The castle's physicians failed, and the only name echoing in the king's mind was the peasant woman, known for healing children with herbs, the very woman he had humiliated. She had made it past the iron gate 3 times before. The 4th time someone was watching. Maren of Ashfield moved through the castle gardens before sunrise, her fingers careful and practiced as they closed around the stems of feverfew and lemon balm. She kept low, her rough wool cloak trailing the dew-wet grass, her breath a faint mist in the cold morning air. The child on her back, bundled tightly in linen and thin wool against the chill, had coughed through the night without rest. A dry, rattling cough that had kept the whole cottage awake and sent Maren outside twice to press her ear to the child's chest in the firelight, listening for the particular sound she had learned to fear. The village healer had told her what she already feared, that without the right herbs, a fever like this one in a child so small could turn before the week was out. Maren was not a woman who waited for things to turn. She was a woman who acted before dawn and explained herself later, if at all. The garden was extraordinary in the half-dark. She could admit that, even as she moved through it with guilty haste, even knowing she had no right to be there. The paths were raked smooth and edged with stone, the beds arranged in the old medicinal style with each plant grouped by its purpose. The wound herbs here, the fever herbs there, the herbs for sleep and for pain and for grief, arranged with a care that suggested someone had once thought very deeply about suffering and its remedies. She thought of Brother Thomas, whom she had met once when she was a child, a round-faced man with soil permanently under his fingernails, who had pressed a handful of dried chamomile into her mother's hands, without being asked and without expecting anything in return. He had been dead 3 years. The garden showed the lack of him in small ways, a path edging loosened here, a labelling stake missing there, but his original design endured, and that endurance was the reason she was here. She had no business being in these gardens. She knew it. Every soul within 10 miles of Aldenmere Castle knew the king's decree, that the grounds beyond the outer wall were kept for the household alone, that any commoner found trespassing would answer for it. The decree had come in the 2nd year of King Aldric's reign after the war, when he had returned a different man than the one who had ridden out, a harder man, a man who had buried his wife and sealed himself behind stone in more ways than one. The villagers had felt it, in the new strictness of the toll roads, in the reduced access to the castle's mill, in the early morning curfew on the common lands that no one could quite explain and that everyone quietly resented. But the herbs grew here because the castle's head gardener, a gentle old man named Brother Thomas, who had since gone to God, had planted them with intention and care decades ago. Nowhere else in the valley did the same plants grow so thick, so pure, so untouched by the blight, that had ruined the lower fields 2 seasons running. And so Maren came before the world woke, took only what she needed, and left. She told herself it was not theft if she never took more than grew back. She was reaching for a 3rd handful of lemon balm when she heard the crunch of boots on gravel, not the soft-footed step of a gardening servant. Heavy, deliberate. She straightened too slowly. King Aldric of Aldenmere stood at the top of the stone path, flanked by 2 guards, who kept their hands on their belts and their faces carefully blank. He was a tall man, lean from years of campaign living, with the kind of jaw that looked as though it had never relaxed in his life. His dark eyes moved from her face to the cloth bundle of herbs in her hands, to the child on her back, and his expression did not soften. "Bring her," he said. The guards did not need to touch her. She walked. He made her stand in the garden's center, in the open space where the rose hedges formed a natural square, and called for the household to witness. Whether by design or simple morning habit, there were enough people present. Kitchen staff, stable hands, 2 of his men-at-arms walking their morning round, a pair of laundry women who had paused in the courtyard, to make what followed feel like a sentencing. One of the kitchen girls was young enough to look distressed on Maren's behalf. She was the only one. "You were told," he said, standing over her with his arms folded, his voice carrying easily across the damp air. "Every person in this valley was told. The grounds are not common property. They are not open to peasants who decide their own needs outweigh the law." He paused, and the pause had a weight to it, not a thinking pause, but a pause meant to be felt. "What did you take?" She held up the small bundle. Feverfew, lemon balm, nothing more. He looked at it as though she had held up a blade. "The herbs are for my child," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later. "She has fever. The village stores were spent through winter. I took nothing that would not grow back before the week is done. I did not ask for your reasons, I asked what you took." He turned to one of his guards. "Record her name and village. She is banned from castle grounds entirely, market days included, for the span of 1 year." The baby on her back stirred and made a thin, unhappy sound. Several of the servants looked away. Maren looked directly at the king. "My husband died at the river Keld," she said quietly, "fighting under your banner. His name was Maren of Ashfield. He was 26 years old. I ask that you consider that before you close the market to a widow and her child." Something moved across his face. It was not quite guilt. It was the thing that lives close to guilt in men who have decided not to feel it. "Take her to the gate," he said. She was walked out through the garden and through the iron gate and set onto the road. She did not look back. There was no use in it. She tucked the small bundle of herbs deeper into her cloak, adjusted the child on her back, and began the walk to Ashfield, which was 4 miles on a road that grew muddier as the morning warmed. She did not know as she walked that she had already set something in motion that could not be stopped. She only knew her daughter was sick and her feet were wet, and there was no one left in the world to help her but herself. The king returned to the castle with his jaw set, and his mind made it halfway through the morning's correspondence before the sound of his son's name dragged him back to the present. "My lord." His steward, Harwick, appeared in the study doorway, and the look on the man's face was enough to bring Aldrich to his feet before a single word was spoken. "It is the prince. He has taken sick." It had come on fast. That was what they told him, over and over, as he moved through the corridors toward the royal wing with his boots loud on the stone floor and his hands already cold. Fast. The boy had been fine at supper. The boy had been asking about the horses just yesterday afternoon. The boy was 8 years old and it had come on fast. Prince Kale lay in his wide bed with his face the color of candle wax, and his breathing wrong. Even Aldrich could hear it, that tight, labored rasp, each exhale costing something. His physician, a learned man from the city who wore robes and charged what amounted to a year's grain tithe for a month of service, stood at the bedside with his kit open and his expression arranged into the particular shape of a man who is beginning to doubt himself but is not yet willing to say so aloud. "The fever is high," the physician said. "I have applied the standard poultice and given him valerian for the restlessness. But the chest," he paused, "the tightening in the chest is unusual. I have not yet identified the precise cause." Aldrich looked at his son's chest rising and falling with effort, and something broke open in him slowly, the way ice breaks in a river when the season turns. Not all at once, but with increasing certainty. "What can you give him for the chest?" he said. "I am preparing a steam and I have sent for additional medicines from the apothecary in Velmere, but Velmere is 2 hours by rider." "Then send the rider." The physician nodded and gave orders to an assistant. Aldrich pulled a chair to his son's bedside and sat with his elbows on his knees and watched the boy breathe and tried to think. He was a man who solved problems through force and through order and through the application of will. He had won battles by thinking faster than the other side and by refusing to accept the possibility of failure. He sat at his son's bedside, and for the first time in years he could not think of a single useful thing to do. It was Harwick who came to him an hour later, when the physician's steam had produced no improvement, and the boy's lips had taken on a faint bluish cast that Aldrich refused to look at directly. "My lord," Harwick spoke low, close to his ear. "One of the kitchen women. She says there is someone, a woman from Ashfield. She says this woman knows herbs, that she has treated fever and chest sickness in children before with some success." He hesitated. "It is the same woman from this morning." Aldrich looked up from his son's face. Harwick held his gaze steadily. "I know what I am saying, my lord." For a long moment the only sound in the room was Kale's difficult breathing and the fire settling in the hearth. "Send riders to Ashfield," the king said. "Find her, and be respectful about it." As the riders found Maren at her cottage at the edge of Ashfield village, bent over a small fire with a clay pot of herbs already steaming. Her daughter was asleep. The feverfew had worked, as she had known it would, and Maren herself had neither eaten nor rested since before sunrise. When the lead rider told her why they had come, she was quiet for a moment. She looked at her daughter's sleeping face. She looked at the rider's expression, which was, as ordered, carefully respectful, but also frightened in the way that men are frightened when they know what is at stake and are not the ones who can fix it. She set down her clay pot. She picked up her herb bag, which she had not yet unpacked. "I need to bring certain things," she said. "Give me a moment." She moved through her cottage with efficiency. Dried yarrow and horehound from the ceiling hooks, a small clay jar of rendered fat, 2 clean pieces of linen. She checked on her daughter one more time, left word with her neighbor Berta to watch the child through the afternoon, and followed the riders out. The castle was lit from within by the urgent, anxious light of too many candles. She was brought not to the gate, but directly to the courtyard, and then directly to the royal wing, and the speed of it told her everything she needed to know about how bad things had become. She passed servants who moved aside for her with uncertain expressions. This same woman who had been walked out the gate that morning, now brought through the front, and she kept her eyes forward and her hands steady around her bag. She was brought into the prince's chamber and stopped inside the doorway and looked. She had expected wealth, the thick rugs, the carved bed frame, the silver candlesticks, and these things were there. What she had not expected, or rather, what surprised her in the specific way that suffering always surprises despite being universal, was how small the boy looked in the large bed. He was a slight child, fine-featured, with his father's dark colouring and his mother's presumably more delicate build. He lay with his head turned to one side and his small chest working visibly with the effort of each breath, and the firelight showed the sheen of fever sweat on his face and the faint shadows beneath his eyes that come from a body spending too much of itself trying to fight. She took in the boy's colour, his breathing, the way his small fingers curled loosely at his sides as if holding onto something invisible. She looked at the physician's equipment arranged beside the bed, the bloodletting tools untouched, thankfully, the stale poultice that had been applied to his forehead and was already dry at the edges, the steam apparatus that was producing more noise than effect, its vapours rising toward the ceiling rather than staying close to the patient's face where they were needed. The king was standing at the far side of the room. Their eyes met. She did not bow. There was no time for it, and something in his expression suggested he knew it. The certainty of a king's authority had gone out of him temporarily, replaced by something raw. He was, at this moment, only a father. "Has he eaten or drunk anything since the fever began?" she said. "Very little. He keeps nothing down," the physician said, with the tone of a man whose authority was being questioned and did not quite know whether to object. "Has he had any pennyroyal, any tansy?" "I don't see what—" "Has he?" She was looking at the physician now with an expression that was not unkind, but was not gentle either. "No, nothing of that family." She moved to the bedside. She set her bag on the table that the physician's instruments had occupied and began to work with the calm of someone who has done this before under difficult conditions and has learned not to let fear into her hands. She built a steam with horehound and yarrow, not from distance as the physician's apparatus had done, but close so the boy breathed it directly, a tent of linen trapping it around his face while she held the clay pot beneath. She watched his chest. She watched his lips. She rubbed the rendered fat mixed with ground horehound onto his chest and covered it with linen and pressed her hand flat against it, feeling for the tightness. The room around her was very quiet. No one spoke. After perhaps 20 minutes, Prince Kale's breathing changed. Not dramatically, sir, nothing so sudden as a miracle, but the rattle loosened. The tight catch at the top of each breath softened. His fingers, which had been curled with effort, relaxed a degree. She heard someone behind her exhale slowly, as though they had been holding the same breath the whole time. She did not turn around. There was still work to do. "He will need this steam twice more before nightfall," she said, still not turning. "And then again in the morning if the chest has not fully cleared. The fever should follow the chest. When one breaks, the other will." She paused. "He should drink weak broth with lemon balm steeped in it. Not until he asks. Don't force it." "How do you know this?" the physician said. There was something odd in his voice. Not quite accusation, not quite wonder. "I had a daughter with the same illness 2 winters ago," she said. "She lived." She finally turned. The king was standing 3 feet behind her. She had not heard him move. His face was difficult to read, too many things on it at once, pressed close together. He looked at his son's sleeping face, which had more colour now, and then he looked at Maren. She waited. "Your name," he said. His voice was different from what it had been in the garden. Still careful, still controlled, but different underneath. "Maren of Ashfield. My husband was Eric. You may or may not remember the name." A silence. "I remember the name," he said. "The river Keld. Yes. He was a good soldier." She looked at him. "He was a good man," she said. "He was only a soldier because you needed soldiers." It was not a cruel thing to say, it was simply true, and something in his expression confirmed that he heard it that way. "You will stay," he said. "Tonight and through tomorrow if the boy needs it. You will have a room and food and whatever you need. I need to send word to my neighbor about my daughter. It will be arranged." She nodded once. She turned back to the boy and adjusted the linen at his chest and checked the temperature of the steam pot and said nothing else. Behind her, the king stood for a long moment, looking at his son's face, and then turned and walked to the window and stood with his back to the room, and if his shoulders moved in a way that might have suggested emotion, no one in the room was going to speak of it. She stayed through the night. She slept in the chair beside the prince's bed in 3-hour intervals, waking to refresh the steam and check his breathing and replace the chest cloth when it cooled. The physician, to his credit, stayed as well, watching her with a mixture of wounded pride and genuine curiosity, and by the 3rd hour of the night, he was asking questions rather than offering objections. At around the time the castle was most silent, that deep, hollow hour well past midnight, when even the guards on the wall walked softly, and the fires in the hall had burned down to coals, the king returned to the chamber. Maren was awake, seated beside the bed, watching the candle with the particular unseeing quality of someone whose thoughts are somewhere specific. She heard his step in the corridor before the door opened, and she did not look up. He sat in the chair on the opposite side of the bed. He looked at his son, who was sleeping now with the looser, easier quality of a body beginning to fight back rather than merely endure. He looked for a long time before he spoke. "He's sleeping better," he said. "Yes. You can tell from here? His breathing. The sound of it is different." She paused. "It is a thing you learn when you have to." He was quiet for a moment. The candle moved in some draught from the door. "In the garden this morning," he said. You acted as you have been accustomed to acting," she said. She was too tired for anything but directness, like someone who has forgotten that the people who live beneath his rule are still people. He did not speak. "You were not always like this," she said. "My husband told me before the war. He said the king used to ride through the villages without a guard, used to know the names of the blacksmiths and the mill workers. He said the king could laugh." She looked at him for the first time. That was what Eric said when he rode out, that he was proud to fight for a man worth fighting for. King Aldrich looked back at her. His jaw was tight, but his eyes had something else in them, something older and less certain than the face he showed in daylight. "He said that," he said. "He did." She looked back at the candle. "I don't think Eric would recognize you now. I do not say that to wound you. I say it because it is possible to become a stranger to yourself, and it is useful when someone tells you." Another silence. Longer this time. "My wife died of fever," he said, 3 years ago. He said it the way people say the hard things, flatly, without inflection, as though the flatness will protect them. The same kind of fever. Fast. Too fast for anyone to... He stopped. She did not fill the silence. She had learned, through her own grief, that some silences needed to finish themselves. "I think I have been angry at fevers," he said. It was such a strange and human thing to say that she almost looked at him again. "Yes," she said. "I understand that. I should not have you..." He stopped again. "This morning. No, you should not have." He absorbed that without flinching, which she noted. "The market ban will be lifted," he said. "And the garden..." He paused. "There is a section near the east wall that Brother Thomas maintained for medicinal plants. The head gardener has standing instructions to maintain it. I will tell him it is to be open to any village healer or widow with a sick child." He looked at her. "That is not sufficient." "I know it is not, but it is something." She looked at him for a long moment. His face in the candlelight was younger than it was in daylight, or perhaps older. She wasn't sure. It was the face of someone who had let something down briefly. "It is something," she agreed. She stayed 3 days. Prince Kale's fever broke entirely on the second morning, and by the second afternoon he was asking for food and then asking her questions with the unfiltered directness that belongs to children and which she found, after all the tension of the days prior, enormously refreshing. "Are you a healer?" he asked. "In a modest way. Do you know how to make soldiers' fever go down? I know how to make most fevers go down. My father gets a fever sometimes from his old wound. He never says so, but you can tell." He considered her with the frank gaze of a child who has not yet learned to be indirect. "I think he needs someone to make him drink broth with lemon balm. He doesn't drink enough broth." She smiled at that, and Kale, who seemed pleased with the result, pressed on. "Are you going to go back to your village?" "Tomorrow, I think. My daughter is waiting for me." "What is her name?" "Liz." "How old is she?" "Nearly 2. He thought about this. "She can come here sometimes," he said, with the absolute authority of a child who has not yet had that authority fully tested against the world. "I will tell my father." She had not expected to be charmed by this child, given what had brought her here, but there it was. The king sought her out on the third morning in the garden. She was in the east section, examining the state of the medicinal herb beds. They were overgrown, and in some places poorly maintained, and she had already, without quite intending to, begun pulling the weeds from around the yarrow. He stood at the edge of the bed and watched her for a moment before she acknowledged him. "I would like to offer you a position," he said. "Not as a servant, as—" He paused, as though he had not entirely worked out the title. "As a keeper of the medicinal garden, and as someone who can be sent for when the castle's own physician is out of his depth." He looked at the herb beds. "Brother Thomas maintained this garden for 30 years. It has not been properly kept since he died." She pulled a handful of chickweed from between the feverfew plants. "The lemon balm has been let go to seed and crowded the yarrow," she said. "It will take a full season to put it right." "Then you would need a full season." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was standing with his hands behind his back and the morning sun behind him, squinting slightly in a way that made him look uncertain in a manner she had not seen from him before. "I cannot live in the castle," she said. "My daughter is in Ashfield. She needs—" "There is a cottage within the outer grounds," he said. "On the north side. It was used by the old gardener. It needs cleaning and some repair, but it is sound. You and your daughter would be housed, fed, your fire kept." He paused. "You would be compensated properly, not in coin only. The cottage is yours so long as you wish it." She looked at him for a long time. He met her gaze and did not look away, and the fact that he did not look away meant something to her. "You are not doing this out of guilt," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am partially doing this out of guilt," he said. "I think honesty is better served by admitting that." She almost smiled. "What is the rest of it?" "The rest of it is that my son needs someone nearby who knows what to do when I don't," he said. "And the rest of it—" He stopped, looked at the herb beds, looked back at her. "I find that I would like to know someone who will tell me when I have become a stranger to myself." It was, she thought, the most direct and the most difficult thing she had heard him say. It cost him something, she could tell. A man like him did not often name what he needed. She stood up. She brushed the soil from her hands and looked at him. "I will need to speak to my neighbor, Berta," she said. "She has been good to me, and I will not leave Ashfield without making sure she is well provided for." "Of course. And the cottage must have a proper window on the south side. Medicinal plants require light. I will speak to the steward today, and I will not be treated as a servant. If I am to be useful here, I need to be able to speak plainly when I think something is wrong." "You have already demonstrated that you are capable of it," he said. "I have not yet walked away." This time she did smile, briefly, controlled, but real. "I will come on the 1st of next month," she said. "That gives me time to settle things in Ashfield properly." He nodded. Then, with a formality that sat oddly next to the conversation they had just had, but that she understood anyway, he said, "I am grateful to you, Maren of Ashfield, more than I have said." "You have said enough," she told him, "for now." She returned to Ashfield. She told Berta everything, and Berta, who had known Maren since before Eric's death and who had a sharp eye for things left unsaid, listened to the whole account and then gave her a look that communicated several things at once. "He came and sat with you in the night," Berta said. "In the prince's room. The child was sick, he was concerned." Berta poured more ale into Maren's cup. "And the cottage with the south-facing window. It is a practical arrangement." "Yes." Berta said it with the particular inflection of a woman who has decided to say nothing more. "Practical." Maren looked at the fire. She was thinking about the way his face had looked in the candlelight, the face of a man who had let something down, who was, perhaps, in the slow and painful process of picking it back up. She was thinking about what Eric had said, that the king could laugh. She found herself curious against her better judgment about whether that was still true. She told herself it was none of her business. She packed her house in the weeks that followed, sorted her herbs, kept the garden in what order she could for the family who would take the cottage after her. She was practical and efficient, and she did not allow herself to sit still long enough to feel anything she couldn't name. On the morning of the 1st of the month, she lifted Liz onto her hip and picked up her bundle and walked to the castle. The months that followed were strange and slowly good. Strange because she was neither servant nor lady, and the castle did not quite have a category for her, and she had to build the terms of her presence through daily negotiation and the quiet assertion of dignity. She did not ask for much. She asked to be addressed by her name rather than her village, to have her conclusions about a patient's condition heard before the physician overruled them, and to eat at the household table rather than the servant's bench, not out of vanity, but because she had decided early on that the way a person allows themselves to be treated establishes the ceiling of what they will ever be treated as. The physician had come around mostly. He was a learned man who was not too proud to recognize that there were things Maren knew that he didn't, and they arrived at a professional arrangement that suited them both, a kind of respectful division of territory that was occasionally tested and generally held. The household staff, cautious at first, warmed to her in the way that people warm to anyone who does their work without complaint and without airs. Strange because Lys, 2 years old and entirely fearless, became the unlikely companion of Prince Kale, who was 8 years old and had, it turned out, been very lonely in the way that children with too many duties and too few equals are always lonely. He was given formal lessons every morning, which he endured, and formal etiquette instruction every afternoon, which he endured less well. And between these things he had learned to fill his time with the particular restless purposefulness of a child who is looking for real connection and being offered only instruction. Lys, who had no etiquette and no restraint and an absolute willingness to fall asleep wherever she happened to be, was apparently exactly what he needed. He taught her to name the horses. She fell asleep in his lessons twice, and he found this hilarious in a way that no one else in the castle quite understood, but that Maren recognized immediately as the laughter of someone who is deeply relieved. He taught her the word for sword in the old language, and she mispronounced it in a way that made him laugh until he couldn't breathe, and Maren, watching from the doorway of the herb garden with her hands still dirty from the afternoon's weeding, felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. Good because of the garden, which she brought back from its overgrown state in the way that feels when you are doing it, like restoration and like grief both at once. The grief of seeing how far something good had been allowed to decline, and the restoration of knowing that it can come back. By midsummer, the yarrow stood straight and separate from the lemon balm, and the feverfew was dense and fragrant along the east wall, and even the physician came to stand at the garden gate sometimes and observe with an expression that was as close to impressed as he seemed capable of. Good, too, for reasons she did not examine directly, because of the king. He came to the garden sometimes in the evenings when the day's work was done. At first he came with a purpose, to ask about Kale or about some household illness she'd been consulted on, and then he came without one, or at least without one, he announced, and they fell into the habit of walking the garden's length together as the light changed and talking about things that were easier to say when you were moving and not required to look at each other. He told her about the war. Not the campaign details he would have told his officers, but the smaller, worse things, the specific weight of making decisions that determined which men lived and which ones didn't, and the way that weight accumulates until it becomes the texture of your entire inner life. She listened without offering comfort she didn't mean, and he seemed to value that. She told him about Eric. Not the grief itself, she kept that private as she always had, but Eric as a person, the way he fixed things with more enthusiasm than skill, always leaving small repairs slightly worse than he'd found them and never noticing. His absolute confidence in his ability to identify birds by their calls, despite being wrong at least half the time. The king listened with the careful attention of someone who wants to remember, and once she caught him smiling at something she'd said, and it occurred to her, with a start, that Eric had been right. The man could still laugh, or something close to it. She told herself she was being careful. She was for a while good at it. It was Harwick who caused the trouble, as stewards sometimes do when they are trying to be helpful. He made the announcement at the harvest feast, in front of the assembled household and the village representatives who had come to pay seasonal respects, and he made it with every intention of generosity, that Maren of Ashfield had become an indispensable member of the castle's household, that the king had decided to formalize her position with a title and an annual allowance that would provide for her and her daughter permanently. What he said after that was said with every intention of complimenting her, and instead exposed something that no one in that room had been ready to have exposed. "It is the king's wish," Harwick said with the satisfied smile of a man delivering good news, "that Maren of Ashfield be recognized as a valued companion to the royal household, and that her place here be made permanent in honor of the service she rendered to the crown and—" he paused for what he thought was pleasant emphasis, "and to the king personally." The room did not react badly. The room simply noticed. And that noticing spread through the hall like heat from a fire, a slight increase in attention, a slight sharpening of looks exchanged between the castle's more established inhabitants, and Maren, seated at the lower end of the hall with Lys half asleep in her lap, felt it land on her like cold water. She left the hall before the toasts were finished. She did not go to the cottage. She went to the garden, which was the only place in the castle that felt entirely her own, and stood in the dark between the yarrow and the lemon balm, and breathed. The trouble was not what Harwick had said. The trouble was that she did not know, had been carefully, deliberately not knowing, whether it was true, whether the king's evening visits to the garden were what she allowed herself to think they were, whether the way he listened to her, the way he changed when he was near her, unhurried, less defended, was what it looked like from the outside, or whether she was filling in the shape of something that was not there. She was a widow with a young child, the daughter of a farmer, the wife of a soldier. He was a king. She had told herself this fact at regular intervals throughout the months, and thought she had processed it fully. Apparently, she had not. She heard the garden gate and knew his step before she turned. "Maren, I am not angry with your steward," she said before he could speak. "He meant it well. I know." He was a few paces away, stopped. "I should have spoken to you first. Before any public acknowledgement, I should have—" He stopped, and she heard in the halt something that she recognized as a man trying to say a true thing carefully. "I have been thinking about how to say something for some time, and I kept finding reasons to wait." She turned then. He was standing in the dark garden with no guards, and no formality, and no ceremony, and he looked like a man who had come to the end of his willingness to be careful. "There are 1,000 reasons why this is," he started. "I know them all," she said. "I have been listing them for months." "And?" She looked at him. The moon was enough to see his face, which was the uncertain open face of the candlelight hours, rather than the closed face of day. "And I am still here," she said. "That should tell you something." He crossed the space between them, and she did not move away. And what followed was not a grand declaration or a gesture of elaborate romance, but something quieter and more real, his hand finding her face, her fingers closing around his arm, and the long exhale of two people who have been holding something difficult and are setting it down. It was not simple. Nothing of this kind is simple, and Maren was not a woman who required things to be simple. There were conversations with the castle's council that were not easy. There was a lord from the northern reaches who made his disapproval known in the particular way that men with old names disapprove of things, by making noise at a distance, and then going quiet when they realized the noise wasn't working. There was the matter of how to explain things to Cale, who it turned out needed no explanation at all, and responded to the news with the shrug of a child who has already, through daily proximity, reached his own conclusions. "I know," he said. "Lys told me." Maren looked at her daughter, who was 2.5 years old. "Lys told you," she said. "She kept saying Papa when she saw Father coming to the garden," Cale said. "She does that with everyone, but it happened a lot." He seemed to consider this a complete and satisfying explanation, and moved on to asking whether there would be apple cake at the winter feast. There were practical negotiations about title and standing that Maren conducted herself, with Harwick sweating lightly on the other side of the table, and she was firm and fair and left nothing ambiguous. There was the matter of a ceremony. The wedding was held in the chapel at midwinter, with the light coming through the high windows at the particular angle that makes stone interiors look warmer than they are. The castle's household was present in full, and the representatives of 12 villages had come, not because they were required, but because word had travelled, as it does. The priest was the same man who had given last rites to soldiers at the River Keld. He performed the ceremony with great care, and a voice that suggested he understood the weight of what he was binding. Maren wore the colour of winter berries, not white, because she was not pretending this was a first beginning and did not wish to. She wore her hair up in the way of the castle women, because she lived in a castle now and there was no point in pretending otherwise, but she wore Eric's ring on her right hand, because that was where it would stay, because he had been real, and he had been loved, and she would not make him smaller to make room for what was new. Lys, dressed in her best wool and deeply uninterested in the ceremony's solemnity, escaped from her designated attendant at the crucial moment and made her way to the front of the chapel with complete confidence, positioned herself between her mother and the king, took one of each of their hands in hers, and looked at the priest with an expression that suggested she was prepared for this to be over. The king looked down at her. Then he looked up at Maren. It was the first time she saw him laugh. A real one, full and brief, surprised out of him. She thought briefly of Eric. She thought he would have liked that sound, After the blessing, when the chapel was full of voices and the winter light was failing through the high windows and the torches were being lit, Aldrich stood with Maren's hand in his and watched his son teaching her daughter to bow to the assembled household, an operation that required enormous effort from both of them and produced a result that bore only theoretical resemblance to a bow. "She will be impossible," he said. "She already is," Maren said. "You cannot say I didn't warn you." "You didn't warn me." "I should have warned you." He squeezed her hand. "I would have stayed regardless," he said. In the hall beyond the chapel, the tables were laid for the winter feast, and the fires were high, and outside the walls, the village of Ashfield and the other villages of the valley were lit up against the dark, and the road that Maren had walked 4 miles on with wet feet and a sick child on her back was quiet under a first layer of snow. She had not been looking for this. She had been looking for lemon balm and feverfew, and she had found them, and the rest of it she had built herself day by day, with the same patience and the same quiet insistence she brought to everything, the understanding that things worth having do not grow without tending, that gardens and people and even kings can be brought back from long neglect if someone is willing to do the work and wait for what grows back. She was willing. She was not afraid. And in the cold chapel of Aldenmere Castle, with her daughter's small hand warm in her left and her husband's steady hand in her right, Maren of Ashfield, healer, widow, keeper of the medicinal garden, and now queen, in fact, if not in easy title, looked at the winter light through the high windows and was quietly and completely at peace. So if this story moved you the way it was meant to, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in a dark garden or a candlelit chamber, if you felt, even for a moment, the weight of a child's breath improving or the sound of a man learning to laugh again, then leave a number below. 0 means it left you cold. 10 means you would tell someone you love about it tonight. We are reading every single one. What number do you give this story?